Okay, so with the universals then, forming the contrary and contradictory of universals, let's just look first at the contradictory. Because the universal, you have, it can be distributed as all or none or some, or it can be indefinite where it's not defined. So we have, say, birds, all birds, or none birds, which would be no birds, or some birds, or just birds. So when we say what we're going to assert is the predicate, we're going to assert are and then the predicate pretty. So the reason why universals are not only different but also more complicated, they're more complicated because there's these 4 different cases for each universal or plural subject, and then then you have, for each universal, you have the contradictory, the assertion and denial for each one, are and are not, for the same predicate. So you get a set of 8 premises for one universal or plural subject. That's why it's complicated. The reason why it's different than a singular subject is because what's really being asserted with a universal subject, what's being asserted primarily is the distribution of the predicate to the subject using these terms, all or none or some, or just being used to the fact that it's undefined and that it's a plural subject, that it could be distributed but it isn't specified, that the predicate could be distributed but is not specified. So how do you form the contradictory? Well, what you have to contradict in the term in these premises is you have to contradict the distribution. And the way that you contradict the distribution most accurately and directly is that if it's all, and it's the distribution, whether it's all birds are pretty or whether it's all birds are not pretty, it doesn't matter. Whether it's an affirmation or denial of the predicate, you keep that part, unlike the singular subject, where you keep that part and you simply form the contradictory of the universal predicate, of the universal distribution of that same predicate. So if it's all birds are pretty, you contradict the all. You contradict the distribution. All, not all birds are pretty. That is the contradictory. If it says all birds are not pretty, the contradictory is not all birds are not pretty. That's the most direct contradiction, that one of them has to be true and one of them has to be false. If you say no birds are pretty, none but is the same as saying no birds are pretty, then the contradictory, which forms such that one must be true and one must be false, no is saying that this does never happen, and some, it says that it does happen, or it is distributed, partly distributed. Why is the universal all birds are pretty not the contradictory of no birds are pretty? It's because they both need not necessarily be true or false at the same time. In other words, if I say no birds are pretty, and to contradict that I say some birds are pretty, if I prove that some birds are pretty, I've contradicted that no birds are pretty. But if I say that no birds are pretty and then prove that all birds are pretty, it's not necessarily true that one is true and one is false. Because if it's false that all birds are pretty, it's still not necessarily true that no birds are pretty. But if it's false that some birds are pretty, then it's necessarily true that no birds are pretty. So these two, none and some, with the same predicate, whether it's in the same denial or assertion, completely the same predicate, denied or asserted, these two form the contradictory. And to form the contradictory of the universal distribution of a positive distribution is to contradict the positive distribution, not all. So those forms will give you the sets of contradictories. All birds, whatever. Not all birds, whatever. No birds, whatever. Some birds, whatever. These two are contradictory. If at first you say some birds, whatever, the contradictory is no birds, whatever. One has to be true, the other one has to be false. That's how you form the contradictories. When it's not specified, you can't really form a contradictory because you never know if it's true particularly and what or not. So this one, if it's not specified, you can't form the contradictory. The contraries are formed when you say all or none, but that really doesn't matter as much. What really matters here is that these are the contradictories. All birds are whatever. Not all birds are whatever. Those are contradictory. Some birds, whatever. No birds, whatever. Okay? Those are the contradictory forms of the plural subjects. Those have to be learned, recognized, and seen. There's a lot of ways to say all, and a lot of ways to say none, and a lot of ways to say some. And first you have to identify the plural subject. See, is it all, none, or some? And recognize what are the contradictory forms, always keeping the same predicate. Unlike the singular subject, where the denial of the assertion forms a contradiction. In this case, you keep the same predicate. In the universal, with the plural subjects, you keep the same predicate. You have to deny the distribution, contradict the distribution in this way.